The 2024 NFL season is just a couple of weeks away, so in today's video, I want to talk about the best games of every single week of the 2024 NFL season. So as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the best game of each NFL week. For this video, I'll be handing out a couple of honorable mentions for each week, but ultimately, I'll give you guys my personal opinion as to which game I think is the best and will be the most entertaining. And lastly, before we get into the video, around 90% of you guys who watch my content aren't subscribed, so if you go on to enjoy today's video, hit the like and subscribe button. But let's get into the video. We are going to begin with week number 1. Now, week number 1 actually starts September 5th with a Thursday night matchup between the Baltimore Ravens and the Kansas City Chiefs, and in my opinion, that is the best game of this week. I do want to hand out a couple of honorable mentions, however. Green Bay versus Philadelphia on a Friday, which I think is an awesome game. And then you also have the Houston Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. And lastly, the last honorable mention I'll hand out here will be the LA Rams versus the Detroit Lions. Ultimately, though, I do believe that the Baltimore versus Kansas City game has a lot of great storylines to talk about there. Obviously, we get to see the reigning champions in the Kansas City Chiefs go up against the team that they beat to get to the Super Bowl in the Baltimore Ravens. And of course, there is also the storyline of this being the first NFL game we're going to be able to watch this season. So I think there's a lot of reasons why this is the best game and most exciting game. You have two great quarterbacks, two MVP-like quarterbacks, and in general, just really two awesome stories competing for a week 1 win. Next, let's talk about week number 2, and the game that I think is the most exciting is going to be the Houston Texans versus the Chicago Bears. Some honorable mentions that I found for this week were the Buffalo Bills versus the Miami Dolphins, the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Atlanta Falcons versus the Philadelphia Eagles. But ultimately, I did decide to go with Houston versus Chicago because of a number of reasons. Number 1, this is a game that's going to be played at 7 o'clock on Sunday, so you get that Sunday night prime time type of game. And I think the biggest story we got to talk about here is CJ Stroud going up against the number 1 pick and one of the most hyped quarterback prospects we've ever seen in Caleb Williams. Now, do I think this is going to be the best brand of football we've ever seen? Probably not. I think ultimately the Chiefs versus the Bengals can be some of the best football we can see the entire year. But I think the storylines kind of write themselves. This is going to be a game where everyone is going to be watching. You get two extremely young and talented quarterbacks duking it out for what will likely be the first time in many years to come. So that being said, that's why I picked that one for week number 2. Next, let's talk about week number 3. And there's a couple of games that I think are good, but ultimately this is not the strongest week of the NFL season. In my opinion, the most entertaining game that we're going to be able to watch this week is going to be the Dallas Cowboys versus the Baltimore Ravens. A couple of honorable mentions, in my opinion, will be the San Francisco 49ers versus the LA Rams, the Dolphins versus the Seahawks, and the Chicago Bears versus the Indianapolis Colts. But as I said, Dallas versus Baltimore to me is a game that is going to be really indicative of how good these teams can be next year. Dallas obviously has a couple of easy weeks in week 1 and 2, so week 3 is really going to be their hardest challenge up to that point. And if Dallas can overcome a team like Baltimore, then I think that does tell you a lot about how good that Cowboys team can be. Then you have the Baltimore side of things where they've already been tested a couple times, obviously week 1 versus Kansas City, and now the Dallas Cowboys in week 3. So if for whatever reason Baltimore is able to beat a team like Kansas City and beat a team like Dallas, they might look like the best team in the league. These are also two teams that don't often face off against one another, so I think that's why this game is really entertaining in my opinion. Next, let's go ahead and look at week 4, and similar to week 3, it's not really the greatest week in terms of quality play, but there's a couple of really good games in this week. The game that I think is going to be the most exciting, again, will include the Baltimore Ravens. They actually have a couple of really entertaining matchups early on in the year. They have a 7 o'clock matchup against the Buffalo Bills, in my opinion, that has a ton of great storylines to talk about. Some honorable mentions for this week, though, will be the Seahawks versus the Detroit Lions, and the LA Rams versus the Chicago Bears. Again, ultimately, Buffalo versus Baltimore kind of stands out against the rest. This is going to be Lamar Jackson versus Josh Allen. And in my opinion, those are already two of the best quarterbacks in the league alongside guys like Mahomes, Burrow, and Herbert. The storylines kind of write themselves. You get this Buffalo Bills team and Baltimore team that were fantastic teams last year, have a lot of changes in the offseason, and are now looking to go full strength into 2024, looking for a championship. Similar to what I said about that Dallas game, this is going to be a matchup where both teams are going to be tested to see how legitimately good they are. Because in a hypothetical scenario, Buffalo might be kind of struggling a little bit early on with some of the continuity issues. So if they could somehow beat a team like the Baltimore Ravens, I think that would tell you a lot about that franchise. Same thing kind of goes for Baltimore. They have an absolutely brutal schedule in the start of the year, so if they can manage to beat a team like Buffalo, that's a big time win. Next up, let's talk about week number 5, and there's a couple of really good matchups. In fact, I think this is an extremely strong week for the NFL, but again, I'm going to have to talk about the Baltimore Ravens because there's an absolutely interesting matchup for them in this week. They verse the Cincinnati Bengals at 12 o'clock in what is going to be a massive matchup for that division. I do personally believe the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals are two of the best teams within that division, and this game could have huge implications for the rest of the season. Some honorable mentions I'll throw out here is going to be Houston versus Buffalo, Green Bay versus the LA Rams, and the Dallas Cowboys versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, Dallas versus Pittsburgh is always going to be a super interesting matchup, not to mention it is at 7. But ultimately, I think Baltimore versus Cincinnati is a massive storyline that can have huge implications for the entire year. Next up, let's talk about week number 6, and similar to some of the other weeks, again, not really a super strong set of matchups for this one, but there are a couple of interesting ones. Ultimately, I do believe the best matchup for this week is going to be the Dallas Cowboys versus the Detroit Lions. We all know what happened last year where the Dallas Cowboys kind of got lucky to win that matchup, and obviously there does seem to be a bit of a rivalry brewing between these two teams, so that's why I have them as my personal favorite matchup for the week. But a couple of honorable mentions I'd like to talk about will be the Buffalo Bills versus the New York Jets. We get to see the Bills with Josh Allen going up against Aaron Rodgers on Monday Night Football. Sounds freaking awesome. And also the Cleveland Browns versus the Philadelphia Eagles at 12. Next up, week number 7 has a couple of really interesting matchups, but I do believe the best matchup of the week is going to be the Chiefs versus the San Francisco 49ers in what is going to be a Super Bowl rematch at 3 o'clock on Sunday. Obviously, this one kind of writes itself. These are two teams that met in the Super Bowl last year. Hopefully, they stay healthy enough to be able to have another all-time classic rematch in week number 7. Some honorable mentions I do want to hand out will be the Green Bay Packers versus the Houston Texans. Obviously, we get Love versus Stroud. That's going to be a really fun matchup, and honestly, I had a hard time picking between Kansas City versus San Francisco or Green Bay versus Houston. And the last honorable mention will be the Bengals versus the Browns, obviously another divisional matchup that could potentially have huge implications for the entire year. Let's move on to week number 8, where there's a couple of really solid matchups in this week, but I think the biggest storyline for this week is going to be the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Cincinnati Bengals. These are two teams that don't often face off against one another, but now that we get a chance to sort of watch this matchup play out, you got the really good and talented Eagles team that are going to be fighting for huge playoff spots to potentially make a championship run versus a Bengals team that's trying to make a comeback after what was a pretty embarrassing 2023 season. Some honorable mentions will be the Dallas Cowboys versus the 49ers, the Indianapolis Colts versus Houston, and the Browns versus the Ravens. Ultimately, the Ravens versus the Browns is an interesting matchup, but I don't think it's as interesting. I do believe the Ravens are clearly going to be the favorite in that one. Then there's Dallas versus San Francisco, obviously two rivalries that have been brewing the past couple years, but has been completely one-sided. And as we head into 2024, I really don't expect it much to change. I think San Francisco should be able to beat the Dallas Cowboys pretty cleanly yet again. So yeah, they're not going to be the winner for that one. Let's go ahead and move on to week number 9, which has a couple of really interesting matchups. And to me, the favorite matchup that I have for this week is going to be the Green Bay Packers versus the Detroit Lions. Some honorable mentions I do want to throw out here will be the Jaguars versus the Eagles, the Chargers versus the Browns, and the Dolphins versus the Bills. But ultimately speaking, I am going to go ahead and give this one to the Lions versus the Packers in what is going to be, yet again, another matchup between two division rivals. Similar to some of the matchups I talked about earlier, this is going to be a matchup that has massive NFC North implications and honestly, massive conference implications for the entire conference. These are two teams that met up last year and split a pair, and I think this year it could be pretty similar. And this is unfortunately a 3 o'clock game. I do wish this was like 7 o'clock or a Monday Night Football game, but still it's going to be a massive game. Week number 10 is an extremely strong week of football games, and this one was one of the harder ones to pick, but ultimately I am going to go ahead and give this one to the Lions versus the Texans on Sunday Night Football. A couple of honorable mentions I will shout out here will be the Bengals versus the Ravens. I already talked about them during week 5, so this is going to be the second of their two matchups for the year. Then you have Dallas versus Philly, another game that honestly could be played on Monday and I think would be an awesome slot for it, but we've seen that matchup so many times and we're going to get that one twice a year anyways, so it isn't as special or polarizing as the other matchups. And the Miami Dolphins versus the LA Rams on Monday Night Football. But ultimately, of course, I'm going to go with the Lions versus the Houston Texans. You got two teams that are, in my opinion, two of the favorites to make it to the playoffs, or make a deep run in the playoffs, I should say. The Lions arguably have the best overall roster in the NFC. I say arguably, I don't know if it is or isn't. We'll have to wait and see. But these are two super hot teams with super hot head coaches that are heading into big time seasons where they have a lot of expectations to be one of the top teams, and that is going to be a massive sort of test for both of those rosters. You have two extremely hot and polarizing teams that are meeting up, and they're going to have a fun matchup. I think this is going to be an awesome game that I think everyone should have eyes on. Next up, let's talk about week number 11. A couple of fun matchups here, and honestly, I had a hard time picking for this one, but I am going to go with the Packers versus the Bears in 12 o'clock matchup, unfortunately, but still, I think that is an awesome game. Some honorable mentions will be the Houston Texans versus the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football, and the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Buffalo Bills, not to mention the Bengals versus the Chargers is also pretty interesting. Ultimately, though, I think that the Packers versus the Bears has a lot of storylines to talk about. This is going to be a rivalry that is sort of rejuvenated after the departure of Aaron Rodgers and the reemergence of Jordan Love, and now this Bears team that is reemerging and looking pretty solid with Caleb Williams. This will be their first matchup of the season that's going to be played in Chicago, so there's going to be a lot of attention put on this game by both these teams. Even if Chicago doesn't have like a particularly great record, this is going to be a game where both these teams want to make a statement and prove that they're clearly the better roster than the rest of them. And as it goes for the other matchups, like yes, Dallas versus Houston is an awesome game. The battle for Texas on Monday Night Football. If you want to say that one's better, I understand, but I just personally think that the rivalry between the Packers and the Bears being rejuvenated in week 11, in my opinion, is such an awesome and interesting matchup. Next up, let's talk about week number 12, a week that has a couple of solid matchups, but I wouldn't say it is the strongest week per se. Some honorable mentions I will hand out will be the Detroit Lions versus the Indianapolis Colts, the Philadelphia Eagles versus the LA Rams, and the Baltimore Ravens versus the LA Chargers. But ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to the NFC second round rematch between the 49ers and Green Bay Packers. Obviously, that is going to be a rematch that means a lot to both these teams. Last year, the Niners kind of got lucky to come back and beat the Packers, whereas the Packers kind of let that game slip away from them. This is going to be a massive test later in the season for both of these teams that are both eagerly trying to make a deep playoff run. You get Jordan Love versus Brock Purdy. We'll see if Ayuk is still there, but there's a lot of really good players on both these teams, and this is just going to be a really fun matchup. These are also two teams that may very well end up playing each other yet again in the playoffs, so there's going to be a little bit of some bragging rights as we head into the playoffs. Let's move on now, however, to week number 13, where there's a couple of really fun matchups. Some games that I did consider for week 13 were Philadelphia versus Baltimore, Green Bay versus Miami, and the San Francisco 49ers versus the Buffalo Bills. But ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to the Detroit Lions versus the Chicago Bears. This is going to be a game on Thanksgiving in the morning. I think there's a lot of storylines to talk about with that one. Historic rivalry that yet again is going to be rejuvenated with all of the young talents on both of these teams. I'm not sure if this one is necessarily going to have division implications per se, but maybe there is a possibility that those games could have it. I just think personally that the rivalry of these two teams sort of being rejuvenated with the young talent with Caleb Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, Sam Laporta, all these young players just kind of speaks the story for itself. I would give it to Philadelphia versus Baltimore because you can make the case that that is a future Super Bowl matchup at some point. But those are two teams that don't really have a rivalry brewing or anything like that, whereas a team like Detroit versus a team like Chicago can definitely be that starting point to a future rivalry for many years to come. Next up, let's talk about week 14. I think this is a bit of a weaker week in the NFL, but there are a couple of really fun matchups here. For starters, a couple honorable mentions I'll hand out will be Green Bay versus Detroit. I already talked about them in an earlier week. They have a matchup already at week 9 set, so this is going to be the second of their two matchups, so that does kind of dilute it a tad bit. Then you have Dallas versus Cincinnati, which I think is a fun game on Monday Night Football. You also have Kansas City versus LA, and of course San Francisco versus the Chicago Bears. But ultimately, I'm gonna give this one to the Jets versus the Dolphins. This is going to be a game that likely will have playoff implications, whether it's for the number 1 seed in that division or the number 2 seed or a spot in the wild card. This is going to be a late matchup that both of these teams will likely need. Not to mention, you also potentially have two extremely dynamic offenses to go along with the Dolphins offense versus the Jets defense. I think this one just kind of speaks for itself. Unfortunately, this is a game that's being played at 12 o'clock, and unfortunately, it's not in New York. But still, I think this one is a massive week for both of these teams to prove what they truly can be and what they can do in the playoffs, and I think that that's kind of what writes the story for that one. Next up, week 15 is a bit of a stinker of a week. There are some fun matchups, but I wouldn't particularly say that there's any great matchups. Some honorable mentions I will hand out for week 15 will be Green Bay versus Seattle, Miami versus Houston, and the Chiefs versus the Browns. A couple of fun matchups, but I will ultimately give this one to Buffalo versus Detroit. In this matchup, you're going to be able to see Josh Allen and Jared Goff dueling it out with two extremely talented teams in a game that doesn't have much rivalry stakes to it per se, but you're going to be seeing two championship contenders duke it out at 3 o'clock in Detroit, where it's going to be loud and rowdy. This is a matchup that I think has a lot of great storylines that can come from it, and in my opinion, it's a really good sign if either one of these teams is able to beat the other team, because it does sort of tell you where they're at compared to the rest of the competition. Next up, week 16 is a week that has a couple of solid matchups. Some honorable mentions for week 16 will be the Browns versus the Cincinnati Bengals, the LA Rams versus the New York Jets, and the San Francisco 49ers versus the Miami Dolphins. But ultimately, I gotta give this one to the Houston Texans versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Unfortunately, it's on a Saturday at 12, which is a really weird spot to put this game. But the amount of storylines that we could talk about for this week, if we assume the Houston Texans are having a good year and maybe have at that point like 10 wins or 11 wins up to that point, then we could potentially be talking about a rivalry between two teams that haven't really ever had a rivalry. Like, the Houston Texans are legitimately going to be one of the teams that could be a threat for Kansas City, and we're going to be able to see it in a regular season matchup in week 16. And in my opinion, the storylines kind of write themselves. You have the younger, maybe a little bit unproven Texans team with their young quarterback in CJ Stroud and their young head coach in DeMeco Ryans going up against this era's greatest team of all time with the Chiefs, who are at this point trying to get a three-peat of championships. You got Stroud going up against one of the greatest quarterbacks we've ever seen in Patrick Mahomes, not to mention the defenses of both these teams. I kind of feel like this one just writes itself. This could be a playoff matchup, and it's more than likely going to be a conference matchup that could have huge implications for the rest of the season. I feel like this one kind of writes itself. I feel like I don't really have to explain that one in too much detail. Next up, week 17 has a bunch of really fun matchups. It's sort of a weird week where we actually get games on Wednesday on Christmas, so that's kind of bizarre, but hey, we'll get some more football. That's cool, I guess. But ultimately, the games that I think are the most interesting will be Dallas versus Philadelphia at 3 o'clock and Baltimore versus Houston. Those are my two honorable mentions, but ultimately, I am going to go ahead and give this one to Detroit versus San Francisco. This is going to be a conference rematch between two teams that maybe could be fighting for that #1 seed in the conference. You got Jared Goff, who's looking for revenge after absolutely blowing it in the conference championship last year. Then you got San Francisco that's trying to continue to prove that they are clearly the better team. Again, this one has playoff implications. It has bragging rights implications. There's a lot of great conversations. If you want to give it to Dallas versus Philadelphia, I do understand that could potentially be a game that may decide who ends up winning the division. But ultimately, I am a little bit more excited to see Detroit versus San Francisco in a conference rematch that could be really entertaining and really physical and a different type of revenge game for the Detroit Lions. And the last week we'll be talking about here will be week 18. This is not particularly a great set of matchups here, but we will be talking about games that I think could have huge implications for the rest of the playoffs. The two honorable mentions I will hand out will be the Cleveland Browns versus the Baltimore Ravens and the Chicago Bears versus the Green Bay Packers. But I'm actually going to go ahead and give this one to the Seahawks versus the LA Rams. For Chicago versus Green Bay, we've already seen them a couple weeks in the past, so it's not like this is going to be a brand new matchup between two teams that haven't played yet. Not to mention, at that point, you already have Detroit, who I think will lock up the 1 seed, so I don't think it's as interesting. And I kind of believe at that point, you might see guys like Jordan Love or Caleb Williams potentially sit out because either they've already made the playoffs or there's just nothing really to compete for. Same thing kind of applies to Cleveland versus Baltimore. Those are two teams that likely will be making the playoffs. Baltimore is likely going to be sitting their guys because they either will have the 1 seed, 2 seed, 3 seed already stacked up. Not to mention they'll probably already be locked for a wild card spot, so I don't think they really have a reason to play per se. Whereas I do think Cleveland might have a reason to play, but I'm just not quite sold on that one. Whereas a team like LA versus Seattle, that could be a matchup potentially for a really premier wild card spot. I think at week 18, there's a chance that one of these two teams maybe isn't in the playoffs and needs to beat the other to make the playoffs. I do believe that San Francisco will win that division, but maybe there's a chance that San Francisco has like an injury or maybe isn't playing up to expectation. And this could be a week that could potentially put a team over a team like San Francisco for that 1 seed. I don't think that's going to happen, but I do believe that this will have further implications in the NFC rather than just like a random matchup that doesn't have too much implications for it. But those are just my picks. If you guys disagree with any of the best games that I handed out, you can let me know in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.